Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. The concept of success and excellence is fraught with tension between communities within Australia. For non-Indigenous Australians, excellence is almost exclusively an economic concept, founded on stolen and inherited resources and privilege. While for Indigenous people, aspiring to this definition of excellence can involve assimilation and the abandonment of culture and values. With the equality gap widening, the stakes for Indigenous Australians to succeed is higher than ever. Wiradjuri man and academic Todd Fernando argues we need to forge new narratives to identify achievement. This is the 2024 session, The Next Frontier.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we walk and gather, with deep respect to elders past, present, and emerging. The knowledge they hold and share has sustained Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures for thousands of years. Despite the upheaval of colonisation, the attempts to sever our connection to the land and to each other, this knowledge remains alive. Carried by generations of custodians who ensure that our stories continue to be told, our cultures continue to flourish, and our connection to country endures. This acknowledgement, though, is more than a gesture of respect. It's a grounding in the truth of where we come from and what continues to sustain us. It's about recognising the deep spiritual connection to country, the legacy of its survival, which has allowed our communities to continue to bear. The knowledge systems that continue to guide us. For me, standing here today as a queer Wiradjuri man is a personal honour. It carries with me the weight of my ancestors, their resilience, their survival, and their love. My story, like many Aboriginal stories, begins long before I was born. It begins with my family, with their struggles, their endurance, their triumphs. It begins with the land itself, Wiradjuri country, which has shaped our people for millennia. Today I want to take a moment to tell you about my family. My mother was adopted out at a young age, part of the systemic removal of Aboriginal children from their families, known today as the stolen generation. The fear of being taken by the state loomed large over many Aboriginal families. The fear of being forcibly removed is a decision, an impossible decision, in the hope of protecting children. My mother's adoption was not a choice made out of love, but out of survival. It was a decision made in the face of systems that viewed Aboriginal families as inherently broken, incapable of raising their own children. My mother carried that trauma throughout her life, but she also carried something far more powerful, a fierce love for her family, her culture, and her people. She never lost that connection to who she was, even as the world around her began to strip it away. And that love, that connection, was passed down to me and my sisters. It became the foundation of our connection, of our strength, and it became our guide. My father, Kevin Fernando, battled with the system. He spent much of his life in and out of prison, having been taken to Kinchela Aboriginal Boys' Home as a child. Kinchela was a place of deep intergenerational trauma for many Aboriginal boys. It was a place designed to break them, to strip away their identities as men, and to replace them with shame and disconnection. But despite everything, my father held on to who he was, his culture, his identity, and his love in his way of his family. He never allowed the system to take from him, even though it tried its hardest. These stories of removal, of forced assimilation, of intergenerational trauma, they are not unique to my family. They are the stories of many Aboriginal people right across this country. For generations, we have been subjected to incredible violence and dispossession. And yet, despite everything, we are still here. My family's story, like so many others, is a testament to the strength of our people, our ability to survive, to love, and to continue on even when everything is taken from us. I grew up in a small town called Condobolin, which is now made popular by Shannon Knoll. For those in the audience who know, they know. And through that connection, I was surrounded by strength. Condobolin is more than just a small rural town in New South Wales. It is the heartbeat of Wiradjuri country. Now, I do acknowledge that most Aboriginal people stake the claim that their country is the most beautiful, but the Western Plains of Wiradjuri country are majestic, and they hold deep cultural significance for our people. The rivers that flow through these lands, the Macquarie, the Lachlan, the Murrumbidgee, are the veins that connect us to our ancestors, to our history, and to each other. Even as a low socioeconomic community like Condobolin, the richness of our culture, of our connection to land, and our resilience remain ever present. Condobolin in many ways shaped me, and I'm still discovering that to today. It taught me that being Wiradjuri wasn't something you carried on the inside, it was something you lived every day. It was in ways that we cared for each other, in the ways that we stayed connected to our land, and in the ways that we refused to let the outside world define who it is that we are. In Condobolin, I learned that the love and community are at the heart of everything. Even in the face of hardships, our families and our connections to each other were our greatest strengths. As a child, I didn't fully understand the depths of what my family had gone through. I knew that my grandmother had been displaced from her land, that my mother had been adopted out, and that my father spent years in prison. But I didn't yet grasp the larger context of colonisation that had shaped their lives until I was much older. And when I was much older, I began to understand that their struggles were not just personal, they were political. They were the result of deliberate policies designed to dismantle Aboriginal families and communities, policies that had been in place for generations. But what I also came to understand was that despite everything, my family was never broken. The love that my parents passed to me and my sisters was a love that had survived countless centuries of violence and dispossession. It was a love that was rooted in our connection to each other, to our culture. It was a love that carried us forward through hard times. That love is the foundation and remains the foundation for me and everything that I do to today. In 2006, I became the first person in my high school's history to graduate Year 12. I graduated high school in Mount Druitt. I didn't see it extraordinary at the time that I was somehow the first. Being the first in my family to graduate Year 12 was also something that was supposed to be extraordinary. To me, it was an extension of my family. To me, it was an extension of what my family had always done: surviving, pushing forward, seizing the opportunities that had been systematically denied to us and to those who came before us. But it felt like, in many ways, the next step in a lineage of resilience and determination. But as I reflect now, I see that it was much more than personal success. It was about breaking the cycles that had defined us, the lives of my families for generation. It was about challenging the deeply ingrained low expectations that had been in place for Aboriginal people. Expectations that told us we were meant to stay on the margins, that success wasn't really for us. It was about reclaiming a future that my ancestors had fought for. a future where they dreamed of but never fully accessed. My graduation wasn't just an individual achievement. In many ways, it was a victory for my family, for my community, and for the generations that had fought to make that moment possible. At the time, my school didn't expect much from its Aboriginal students. The fact that I was the first Indigenous student to graduate with a HSC speaks to the systemic barriers that had been in place for so long. There had been many Indigenous students before me, but the structures around us weren't designed for our success. In fact, they were often designed to ensure our failure. It was a system that assumed we would fall through the cracks, that would remain trapped in cycles of disadvantage, and that we were not destined for the same kind of achievement as our non-Indigenous peers. Yet when I crossed that stage, I knew I was defying the expectations. I knew I was carrying with me the strength of my family. And there it was again, that love and that perseverance. It had prepared me to walk through the doors that had been closed to them. My graduation was not just an academic achievement, but it was about the barriers that had held us back for so long. It was about standing in a space that had not been built for us and declaring, I belonged here. Not because I worked hard, or because my mum got me up for the bus in the morning, but because we have always belonged, even if the system around us didn't recognise it. Before I went to university, I took on a profoundly interesting role that shaped my understanding of the world and its place in it. One of my very first jobs was as an Aboriginal education officer out at Putland Juvenile Remand Centre in Western Sydney. It was the first time I truly came face to face with the stark reality of the system that disproportionately trapped Aboriginal men and boys. The weight of statistics suddenly became personal. I had always heard that Aboriginal men had two options. Either you would be somewhat okay, or you would end up in prison. Working in this space made holding both of those truths possible, that I had somehow stumbled my way into prison. But for the first time I understood, and I stood alongside these young boys, many whom were Aboriginal themselves, many of whom felt like kin to me. I saw myself reflected in their stories. I recognised their hustles, their sense of hopelessness, and their frustrations with the system. In many ways, their stories mirrored my own. We shared a history, we shared a culture, and we shared the same systemic barriers. And yet, there we were, on opposite sides of the divide. I was the officer, given the chance to flourish within a system that was built to hold them back. They were the boys on remand, caught in the machinery of a system that had been designed to hold them down. It was a deeply, deeply unsettling realisation. How had I been given the opportunity to walk a path that led me toward education and empowerment, while they were trapped in the cycle of incarceration and marginalisation? It wasn't because they lacked potential or intelligence. Many of them were as sharp and as resilient as anyone I'd ever met. But it was because the system had failed them. The same system that allowed me to flourish had also closed the doors to them, pushing them toward a future that they had very little control over. In many ways, the boys and I had shared a common struggle. We had grown up in a very similar community, faced very similar barriers, and dealt with the same systemic racism that had been built in the fabric of our lives. We had seen our families torn apart by the same forces, our people pushed to the margins by policies that were never designed to uplift us. And yet there I was, standing on the other side of the fence, offering education and support while they were being held in the grip of a system that treated them as if they had no future. There was a deep sense of tension in this reality. I understood that pain and that frustration and that hopelessness because I had felt it too. But I knew that I'd been given an opportunity because I had felt that too. I'd managed to navigate my way through a system without falling into its traps that had so often caught those men and boys. The truth is, it could have easily been me on the other side of that fence. In fact, I knew it in the eyes of the system. We weren't so different. But even as I worked alongside them, there was a part of me that was still searching for my own answers. How could I reconcile the privilege I had gained with the knowledge that so many of my brothers, boys just like me, were being left behind? How could I hold both truths, that I had flourished in a system designed to oppress us, while so many had been swallowed by that very same thing? Working at Putland was a very interesting turning point for me. It forced me to confront the realities of a systemic injustice in a way that was far too personal. You know, those boys, I often wonder where they are now, whether they actually made it out, whether they made it to big jail and succumbed to that prison life. They taught me that our fates are not predetermined by our potential, but by the opportunities we were given and the systems we are forced to navigate. They showed me that despite everything, they were still fighting for their dignity, for their futures, for a sense of hope that the system had tried to strip away from them. They reinforced my belief in the power of resilience, the power of culture, and the power of community. As I left Putland to pursue higher education, I carried their stories with me. I knew that my journey was not just my own. I was walking a path that had been denied for so many. When I resigned from Putland Remand Centre, I had a deep understanding of myself and my future. Leaving that role wasn't easy because I was walking away from those boys. I walked away from the life that they had succumbed to, knowing that I was often on a path of greater destiny. And as I prepared myself to walk away from working within the justice system, I found myself confronting a difficult question. What did it mean to aspire to something more when so many had been denied that opportunity? This was the very first time I was forced to reckon with the idea of aspiration, of excellence, and what those concepts truly meant for somebody like me. Growing up, I'd been taught the survival, the resilience of pushing forward no matter the obstacle. But now, standing on the edge of a new chapter in my life, I found myself questioning whether survival was enough. Was I allowed to aspire to something greater? Could I embrace the notion of excellence? Or was that somehow a betrayal of the community and the struggles we had faced together? When I finally stepped into higher education, I did so with a new understanding of what it meant to aspire to excellence. I wasn't there just for myself. I was there for my family or for my community or even for the boys at Putland. I think I was there to challenge the narrative that excellence belonged only to those who fit neatly into the system of power, the system of privilege. Maybe I was there to redefine what excellent truly meant for us as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. What I found myself contemplating more and more on was that excellence was more about, let me restate that. For me, excellence was about more than individual achievement. It was about creating space for others to rise, breaking down barriers and challenging systems that held us back. Then I left. I was searching for something else. I didn't fit in when I first started at university, partly because I didn't fit in with me. As I stepped away from university, I took a drive back to Wiradjuri country, one that I'd done more times than I can ever recall. But on that drive back to country, I was driving back onto country as an out gay man. That was a weird realization. I know what it means to be Wiradjuri, my inner Wiradjuri. I've contemplated what it means to be Aboriginal. There are many, many ways to identify Aboriginality. There are clear rules, protocols, boundaries. There exist public and private determinations. But to be a gay Aborigine? Jesus! Nobody had ever told me what that meant. As I drove back to country, I wasn't sure the kind of reception that I would receive. The fear that my identity as a gay man might somehow conflict with my identity as an Aboriginal man. It loomed large. I had spent so much of my life navigating spaces that weren't built for me, spaces where my identity as a queer and as an Aboriginal felt like something had to be reconciled. It could never really be celebrated, could it? So I returned to the land that shaped me, and I wondered if I would be welcomed in with the fullness of which I had become. But as I stood onto country once again, I felt something shift. The lands, the rivers, the hills, they didn't care about my pronoun. They didn't care about the labels that I had carried with me back onto country. I'd felt a deep sense of belonging, not just as an Aboriginal person, not just as a queer man, but as a full being. My identity, I learnt, was not something to be reconciled. It was something to be embraced. It was a part of who I was and who I am, woven into the fabric of me being me. It reminded me of the connection to my country, deeply personal, very poetic. Maybe the black and queer is somehow there. It was a profound liberation. And I had spent so long feeling like I had to compartmentalize the different parts of myself, navigating systems that didn't allow me to fully be seen. But on country, there was no need for that. The land knew who I was. It had always known all along. And in that moment, I'd felt a deep sense of peace, that I didn't have to choose between being gay and being Aboriginal. I could be both, fully and unapologetically. In the years that followed, I would find myself going back to the university. It was a journey from country to campus. And when I arrived onto the university campus, fuller, more me, more understanding of who I was, I realised that I was entering a different country, the university campus. It had its own rules, its own customs, its own way of being, of doing, of thinking. The university, I realised, was a place built on generations of excellence, with each generation being more curated, sharper, more fixed in its identity. It was a world where excellence was defined by rigorous standards, by academic achievement, and by a history that didn't always include people like me. Obviously, for a while, I felt like I was an outsider in this place. The architecture, the language, even the rhythms of life on campus were foreign to me. I'd grown up in Condo. I'd graduated high school in Mount Druitt. The University of Sydney, the University of Melbourne were foreign places to me, with its sandstone and not ochre. Foreign. It had its own sense of time and its own sense of space. At university, I was confronted with the reality that I was surrounded by a peculiar and a particular sense of what it meant to be excellent. It was curated, polished, sharp-edged. But I also felt like there was room for everything and anything, particularly things that were outside of the norms. And then that curiosity of difference had been long established before I even walked onto campus, that somehow there was another person like me that had walked the rooms before. But as I walked across campus, I felt the weight of history in the air. The halls were lined with portraits of scholars, all celebrated for their intellectual achievements. The names engraved on plaques belonged to people who had shaped fields of study, founded institutions, and left legacies that had endured for generations. But as I moved through these spaces, I couldn't help but notice what was missing. There were no faces that looked like mine. No one had the same skin colour that I did. They had the hair, the scraggly hair, but nobody had my nose, my lips. I yearned for a mirror that would show me. I found myself wondering where I fit into that world. How could I claim excellence within a system, within a wall, within an architecture, within a space where I was so longed being locked out? How could I thrive in a space that had historically excluded people like me? The expectations at university became very clear. Success was defined by academic achievement, by fitting into the mould that had been created over centuries of intellectual tradition. At times, I'd felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between two worlds. On one side, an emphasis on intellectual rigour, academic achievement. On the other, a family still starving, a community still poor, environmental climate changing country in ways that we'd never seen before. But I was given an opportunity. I was there. Some white woman gave me a scholarship. I had to uphold it and I had to honour it. Because if I'd walked away, I was also taking with me the generations of those that came after. That tough expectation that if I had failed, then so too did other Aboriginal people would fail. That the expectation of saying, thank you for your money, but you've misspent, you've misplaced. That ate away at my soul more times than I could text home saying, I don't have money for you this time. The white woman didn't give me another scholarship. I'm joking, she did. Of course she did. University confronted me on the idea of excellence. And in that time, I yearned for more. In 2009 to 2012, the then Labor governments under the Rudd era financially supported a number of national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership retreats. In that time, I had met thousands of young Aboriginal people who were also on the trajectory to break the cycle of disadvantage in their communities. At one particular national leadership retreat, I'd met the first doctors, the first lawyers, the first CEOs, politicians who were Aboriginal, who had walked into those boardrooms and demanded a greater sense of excellence and success. It's where I first saw Marcia Langton, off into the distance like a little flurry that she is. Smart, strategic, eager. I was in awe. I'd met queer Aboriginal people who succeeded for the very first time in my life. These were the people, the portraits that I had longed for on the halls of university campus. For the first time in my life, I had met people who'd mirrored back my own aspirations and my own desire to achieve success without compromising the identity given to me. It would be a number of years later that I'd meet Marcia again. She would become my honours supervisor, and then she became my PhD supervisor. I remember the very first time I sat down and handed over a chapter of work. Never do that. Jesus. Red pen dashed right throughout. Cut me down. But she said, come back next week. And so I did, for 12 years. Each week would sit with her as she refined my thinking and my work. I'm still intimidated by that woman, thoroughly impressed by her life's work. I realized in that moment and in those moments with her that excellence could never, ever, ever be about the grade that I got, about the work that I contributed on a piece of paper that a tutor would only read. It was about the sacrifice of yourself as you walk through your communities and whether people still talk to you or not. About the sacrifice of being on TV and asking Australians to do the good old thing of backing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then waking up the next day and doing it again when they said no. Excellence, success, purpose. These are the questions that I've been left wondering and pondering as I've looked at how I've framed my life in Australia. You know, when I became the Commissioner for LGBTIQA Communities, or the Chief Gay of Victoria, as my mum called me, it was a very daunting experience. Here I was, the youngest commissioner in Australian history. I was 31 when they gave me the keys to that office. I was also the first Aboriginal person to lead a non-Aboriginal commission. Here I was, an Aboriginal gay man in charge of all the gays in Victoria. Jesus. So I had to deeply find a new sense of what excellent meant, of what success meant, because I was no longer fighting just for my community. I was fighting for strangers on the street, for trans people living in regional, rural communities that I'd never and probably will never still meet. That I was fighting for people whose names and whose experiences of a system that had been designed to break them, broke them. They were in many ways, while I was in that role, the new boys at Putland. That somehow I found myself being in place where I could do something, where the day-to-day lives were affected by the decisions that I made, by the negotiations that I held with me as I walked with ministers or with premiers who would negotiate with me on their lives. A 31-year-old was asked to do that, to negotiate with ministers and premiers about the lives of people who I didn't know their names. But what I did know was that they aspired to excellence. They aspired to a success and to a greatness that could never be presented in a policy. That their framework of excellence was to flourish. And I knew a lot about flourishing because we all have a deep desire to do it. So when I wound up and concluded my term as Commissioner, I went back to the concept of excellence. And I thought to myself, having had done that experience, am I now excellent? We had built in Victoria the first whole-of-government LGBTIQ+ strategy. Nowhere else in the world had a government had designed something like that. And this was pre-ChatGTP days, so I had to come up with it all by myself. But I had an excellent team around me. People who had deeply cared about the issues that we were talking about. But during that experience, I reflected on what my role and my title as Commissioner was. And I remembered reading an article while I was in undergrad about the Chief Protectorate of the Aborigines, ones who had designed the policies that ultimately affected my grandmother and my mother and my father. And I realised in that moment, shit, I'm the Chief Protectorate of the gays. But it felt different. It felt different because I had come from the lives in which we were talking about. I had understood deeply their desire to flourish and their desire for excellence. But I grappled with these questions. And so I realised that the notion for excellence for Aboriginal people and all those who have ever been marginalised in the process is deeply complex. For so long, our stories of success are framed by survival. We are only celebrated when we overcome adversity, when we break through the barriers that colonisation, patriarchy has placed before us. But what does it mean to be excellent when we are no longer in survival mode? What does it mean to thrive on our own terms, outside the shadows and the shackles that keep us in our place? I began to see that excellence wasn't about escaping poverty or rising above my own origins, but it was about proving that I could succeed in a system that wasn't made for me. That my excellence was rooted in something much deeper, in wisdom and in strength. Was it enough to be excellent in response to oppression? Are questions that still loom large. Can I only be excellent in the face of colonisation? Can women only be excellent when patriarchy doesn't exist? Can disabled people only be excellent when they don't cut $14 billion from the NDIS? I realise that the questions around success and excellence are all intertwined, that our own understanding of living with fear of a system that at any moment can cut us down doesn't aspire us to flourish. So, I have to believe that our excellence has to come from our communities. It cannot be individual. For if it is individual, we forego the people that watch us as we graduate and walk across the stage. The people that come and pay $35 to see me talk, which is wild in a cost of living crisis. Excellence, in many ways, is, as Aristotle once said, repetition. to continue to do something and do it again and again and again. When I graduated my PhD, there was a moment where I walked across the stage and I had this out-of-body experience. So I remembered my mother being there when I graduated Year 12 for the first time. Yet here I was about to be proclaimed Dr. Fernando, and I look out into the audience and there's my mother sitting next to Marcia. It was a surreal moment. That excellence between the two of them, very similar age, is far in between. So I don't know what excellence is in the end. I think I am. I think we are. But who knows? Thank you.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.